Right now, the world is watching one of the most dangerous choke points on Earth. The Strait of Hormuz. Nearly 20% of global oil supply normally passes through this narrow stretch of water, and at the moment, tanker traffic there has collapsed. Iranian drones are attacking ships. Oil exports are disrupted. Energy markets are starting to react. And for Donald Trump, that creates a serious problem. Because no matter how many Iranian military targets the United States hits, no matter how many of the regime's missile sites are destroyed, Washington cannot claim victory until oil starts flowing through the Strait of Hormuz again. And right now, that outcome is far from guaranteed. So today, we're going to break down why the U.S. has been pulled deeper into this conflict than expected, why Iran's strategy is working better than many analysts predicted, and why the real measure of victory isn't military success, but whether ships can safely pass through the Gulf again. Part 1. The Strategic Trap. When this crisis first began, many in Washington believed the United States held overwhelming military advantage. And in conventional terms, that is true. American forces can strike Iranian infrastructure, missile sites, and military bases across the region. And by most reports, those strikes have been extremely effective. But here's the problem. Iran doesn't actually need to win a traditional military confrontation. It just needs to disrupt the global energy system. And to do that, Iran is relying on a very simple tool. Drones, low cost, relatively easy to deploy, and extremely difficult to defend against. A single drone attack on a tanker doesn't need to sink the ship. It just needs to make insurers, shipping companies, and governments believe the route is no longer safe. Because the acceptable level of risk in global oil shipping is essentially zero. If tankers start getting hit, even occasionally, the entire system slows down or stops. And that is exactly what we are seeing now in the Strait of Hormuz, which creates a strategic bind for the United States. Because Washington currently has 3 missions in the region: protect Gulf allies, escort commercial shipping, and destroy Iran's drone launch capability. The problem: the U.S. military cannot realistically do all 3 at once. And until that equation changes, tanker traffic through the strait will remain extremely risky. Part 2, WHY. Military success, ISNT. Enough at first glance, the United States appears to be winning the conflict. Iranian military infrastructure has taken significant damage. Ballistic missile facilities have reportedly been hit. And American air power has demonstrated clear dominance in the region. But strategically, that may not matter, because Iran doesn't need ballistic missiles to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. Drones are enough. Cheap drones that can be launched from small boats, coastal sites, or mobile platforms that are difficult to track. Which means the real question in this conflict, ISNT. How many Iranian military assets have been destroyed? The real question is much simpler. Can oil tankers safely pass through the strait again? If the answer is no, then the crisis continues. And that's the uncomfortable reality facing Washington right now. Military success does not automatically translate into strategic victory. Part 3. The Political Clock. While the military timeline could stretch for weeks, or even months, the political timeline is much shorter. Gasoline prices in the United States are already climbing. And they are approaching the politically sensitive level of $4 per gallon. That matters. Because American voters historically react strongly to rising fuel prices. At the same time, skepticism about another Middle East conflict is growing, even within the own political coalition of the president. Some Republicans have begun expressing concern about deeper military involvement. Meanwhile, financial markets are watching energy prices closely. If oil prices spike significantly, the economic consequences could spread far beyond the energy sector. All of this creates intense pressure on the White House. Pressure to show progress, pressure to demonstrate success, and eventually, pressure to declare victory. But that's where the strategic dilemma appears, because declaring victory while tankers are still under attack would ring hollow, and Iran understands that, which means Tehran has every incentive to keep the disruption going as long as possible. Part 4. The 3 factors that will decide the war. So what actually determines how this conflict ends? 3 key factors. First, reducing Iran's drone threat. Right now, the most realistic strategy for the United States is continued offensive strikes, aimed at degrading drone launch capabilities that could involve expanding the target list, including sensitive sites near the main oil export infrastructure in Iran. For example, facilities around Karg Island, which handles the majority of Iranian crude exports. But these operations take time, and during that time, shipping disruptions may continue. Second, the threat of naval mines. Mine warfare is one of the oldest asymmetric naval tactics in existence, and it is extremely effective. Mines are cheap to deploy, but extremely slow and dangerous to remove. The United States does have specialized vessels capable of clearing mines, including littoral combat ships and Coast Guard cutters. European naval forces could also assist in protecting airspace and shipping lanes. But all of these operations become much more difficult if drone attacks continue. And that brings us to the third factor: oil markets. Washington has several economic tools it can use to soften the impact of disrupted Gulf exports: releases from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, temporary policy changes affecting domestic shipping, and even adjustments to sanctions on other oil producers. But these are temporary measures. They buy time. They do not solve the underlying problem. There are also alternative export routes from the Gulf. Saudi Arabia can ship oil through pipelines to the Red Sea. The UAE can export crude from the port of Fujairah. But these routes cannot fully replace the enormous volume of oil that normally flows through the Strait of Hormuz, and they also introduce new vulnerabilities. For example, if the conflict expands to include the Houthi movement in Yemen, Red Sea shipping could come under threat as well, which would open an entirely new front in the energy war. Part 5, the hardest part: ending the war. Even if the military and economic pressures become manageable, another problem remains. Politics. Ending a conflict like this requires both sides to step back. But neither side wants to move first. Iran does not trust the United States to stop military operations, and Washington does not trust Tehran to halt attacks on shipping. In theory, outside mediation could help, but that presents another complication. President Trump strongly prefers to claim credit for diplomatic breakthroughs, personally, which makes it unlikely that major external mediators, such as Russia or China, will play a visible role. Instead, any eventual de-escalation may involve quieter diplomacy through regional partners, countries that can communicate with both Washington and Tehran, and allow both sides to claim some form of success. So what becomes of this war? For now, the conflict has no quick exit. The United States has demonstrated overwhelming military power, but that alone does not reopen shipping lanes. And until tankers begin moving safely again through the Strait of Hormuz, Washington cannot credibly claim the crisis is over. So the most likely path forward is the one we are already seeing: continued strikes, continued pressure, and a slow effort to reduce Iranian ability to disrupt global energy flows. Only when ships start moving again will anyone be able to say, this crisis is truly under control.